what is a way that those listening can best support and connect with, and eventually, Lord willing, sow the gospel to their Slavic neighbors?
Excellent question. A lot of Slavic people, even Christians, are not learning that they cannot build connections with the local people, the Canadians here. They're realizing that for a short period of time, they'll be super friendly. They'll smile, say, "How are you? We love you. You're so great. Do you need this? Do you need that?" Just push it. But there's a barrier. And I think it's not just the Ukrainian culture, it's the Southern cultures and others. Invite them for dinner. Share your life. Talk to them. Don't talk to them like, I'm this, you're that. I'm human, you're human. You went through something. I'm going through something. And genuinely become their friend, like Jesus and Zacchaeus. If you're able to become friends with that Slavic friend, and not just, like I said, don't make them feel like you're just inviting them for dinner so you can share the gospel right away. Become their friends.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. This podcast features stories of Canadian church planters and leaders who are influencing kingdom movement and impacting their communities. Whether you're a church planter, pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or someone just wanting to learn more, we pray you get inspired to become a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. We pray this is a blessing to you, and if it is, we would ask you to share links to episodes, subscribe on whatever platform you are using. With that, let's get to our next conversation. Welcome, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. Thanks for joining us for another episode and another conversation. Well, if you haven't heard already, we are now on YouTube. You can find us on YouTube by searching the Sowers Pod, and all of these episodes are now available over there in their video format. If you find us, why don't you go ahead and hit subscribe, and you'll be notified in your YouTube feed when a new episode is released every single Tuesday. If you haven't already, you can also follow us on Apple Podcasts and in Spotify, also in Amazon Music. Go ahead and hit follow or hit subscribe. And once again, you'll get notified whenever a new episode is released. And if you don't mind, please also provide us a rating, which will help our podcast in its growth and its promotion. We don't have a particular marketing department, and so your word of mouth and your sharing and your rating of this podcast significantly helps in more people hearing about this podcast and listening in to these conversations. Well, I'm excited for you to hear a conversation that I had with Alexander Krupin, who was born in Ukraine and moved to Canada when he was 14. Alex came to faith through reading the New Testament that he received at a local food bank. Alex is now a business owner. He runs a decking supply company. He also started a Trupinka summer camp, and he also pastors a church called Light to the World Church in North Toronto. Alex and I talk about reaching Slavics, and we also talk about what it means and looks like to be a bivocational or a covocational pastor. I think you're going to be blessed by this conversation. And so without further ado, here is my conversation with Alexander Krupin. Well, Alex, a very special welcome to you. Thank you for joining the Sowers Podcast today.
Matt, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
I was wondering if you'd begin, Alex, by sharing with us your story of coming to know Jesus Christ. How was the gospel sown to you?
Gladly. I was born in Ukraine at a time when the Soviet Union was collapsing. The atheism was fading away, but Christianity is just about to enter, Ukraine through various forms. And I guess I started getting some printed materials, seeing pictures of Jesus. I remember that as a kid, in the early 90s, they started playing these cartoons called Superbook. And that was a great investment that ministry made by buying a lot of airtime. Back then, you could buy a lot of airtime very cheap in Ukraine and expose millions of people to the gospel. And I was one of those people. And I learned about Jesus. I liked Jesus. I thought he's a great guy. He did all these miracles. He was kind and special. But obviously, it was not the full gospel. I haven't really accepted it. Then being very poor in Ukraine, a lot of economical issues, my parents sent me to a religious Jewish school. My mother's mother, my grandmother, was fully Jewish, and by Jewish, religious belief, I'm fully Jewish because they count on the mother's side. So they sent me to a Jewish school where I started learning about Torah, which is the first 5 books of Moses, dressing like, wearing kippah and all of these attributes that Jews have. and really learning about God and learning God's law. Going to Jewish camps every summer, spending whole summers in Jewish camps and immersing in the Jewish culture. But at the same time, my great grandmother, she was born before the revolution of 1917. She still retained that faith in Jesus prior to communism. And she passed away 5 years after I was born, and she made sure that I was baptized as a baby before she passed away. So going to the Jewish school, I had that identity crisis, so to speak, trying to figure out. At school, they're telling me you are 100% Jewish, but I also know that I was baptized, and the decision that I made is since I was already baptized, I'm not getting circumcised as a Jew because ultimately it's the same God. I don't want to upset him. I think Christianity is more for me because I'm already baptized. I'm not going to change my faith, so to speak. Fast forward, we come to Canada in 1997, and somehow at the age of 14, when I'm here, I start developing this desire to get closer with God. I don't know where it came from. I know now where it came from. Back then, I didn't know. So I started attending the Russian Orthodox Church here in Toronto, attending their services, and it's in a language you cannot understand. It's a bunch of traditions that I don't understand. But one thing that I do is somehow I learned to say, how do you pray? And they showed me the Lord's Prayer, and they showed me morning prayers, evening prayers, and actually I write them down. I created for myself a little booklet, made it myself, didn't print it, and I would read these prayers daily. And the other thing that my family was doing is they were getting food from food banks. So again, poverty drove us to these places. And one of them is called Scott's Mission here in Toronto. Along with a package, they would give you a Bible, which didn't say Bible. It's the Gideon's Bible, which I now know to be the Bible. But back then, I see this little book, and it says New Testament and Psalms. And I have no idea what that means. So we got a few of them, and I started to wonder, what are these books that we're getting? So I started reading it, and then there's the story of a man who founded the Gideon Society, and he writes about how he made a commitment to read the Bible every day of his life and how much of a blessing it was in his life. So being young and passionate and somehow desiring to be with God, even though it was a subconscious decision, I would say, I said to myself, you know what, I'm going to read this every day. So here I am with my big Jewish background and not accepting Judaism, not just on the basis of the fact that I didn't align with my identity, but also I hated the hypocrisy. I hated the fact that these people, they were not necessarily bad people, but getting to know them closely, people who are now rabbis, they're just the same people as everyone else is. They're just the same as Ukrainians. They're not any different from anybody else. They dress differently. They did all these very religious things, but as people, there's good and bad, and there's some bad things that they do, and there's some good things that they did. I thought that there's a lot of hypocrisy, and there's too much emphasis on the outwardly performance. Like nobody ever tells you in Jewish school, like love your neighbor or do this. You repeat the prayer saying, love the Lord your God. This is the Shema prayer, in the central prayer of the Jewish people, and you don't know what it means. They would force us to repeat prayers like pages and pages and memorize a lot of Hebrew scripture that you don't understand. So I always rejected that part. So here are three things coming together. I start reading the scriptures and I go, chapter by chapter every day. For while my brother is showering, I have 10 minutes of privacy because we share the room. I read a chapter each day, and then I say the Lord's Prayer. Somewhere around Christmas of 1998, when I get to Matthew chapter 5 or 6, to the Sermon on the Mount, I read that sermon, and I'm just astounded at the wisdom of Jesus. I'm so excited about the scriptures, what I'm reading. But what really touched me is the fact that he's talking about inner purity. When I read the chapter, I live with my brother in the same room who is a year younger. And, I hated him. I hated the fact that we have to share the room together. We didn't get along very well. Now we do, but back then we didn't. And when I read, anyone who hates their brother is worthy of murder. Anyone who looks upon a woman has already committed adultery. And, I'm a teenager, right? So I'm dealing with these. I never knew that, there's God requires us to be pure on the inside. So somehow the Spirit is working, and I'm now realizing that I'm a sinner, that I am sinning against God. Which prior to that, I knew I'm a bad person. I do bad things, but I didn't know to that level. And somehow reading that Lord's Prayer, and really it was reading. It was not praying intentionally. It was just reading. I felt something. That day I felt something which I interpreted to be the presence of God. Somehow it helped me, gave me strength. Even that night, it gave me that assurance that I can fight the sins in my life. So I didn't know anything about second birth. I didn't get to the Gospel of John yet. I didn't know anything about coming to faith or getting salvation, being saved from my sins, having eternal life. I knew nothing of that sort. But what I knew was God is in me. But then I thought to myself, maybe it's just an emotional thing that I had. Let's see what happens tomorrow. I went to bed. I wake up with the same feeling. It did not leave. So I realized it was not just an emotion. And then back then we had we didn't have cable. We didn't have money for cable. So we had antennas. And with an antenna, you can only catch 9 basic channels. One of them was the 100 Huntley Street, or CTS now it's called. David Means was in charge of that channel, but they had a lot of different preachers. By now it's a good and bad, all kinds of preachers. But God opened my ears. Before, when I flipped through the channels, anytime I see somebody preaching, I don't know what they're talking about. It doesn't make any sense. I would always flip to another channel. Now, what I read in the scriptures and what I hear online, not online, on the television, seems to line up. After about a week and a half, my family said, enough of your television, because you have one television set for the whole family. I was like, we're not watching this. This is crazy. So I took all the money that I had and bought myself a television, put it in my room. I was in grade 10. I learned how to, take notes. I would listen to sermons. Joyce Meyer, great. Benny Hinn, great. But then you had somebody like Charles Stanley. You had other preachers on that television. I would take notes. I would learn, but it was just me, the Holy Spirit, the Bible. And in a couple of months, actually a month and a half after my conversion, I saw that John Hall was preaching from People's Church in Toronto, and there was the address on Shepherd Avenue East. It was about an hour and a half away by subway from my house, and that's when I went to a Protestant church for the first time. So my journey since then has been rocky. There's been a time when I questioned my faith and left it for a while when I was a teenager, but then I came back as a 25-year-old adult and really made a solid commitment for Christ, and has been, growing in Him ever since.
Share with our listeners a little bit about your background in Ukraine. What was the motivating factor for you to come to Canada?
So it was my parents' decision, and it was purely financial money. To be honest, life was difficult, and a lot of people can have a better life here in Canada. For my mother, my mother and my father left me when I was 4, so it was my stepfather. For my stepfather, it was himself and really building a better life for himself. And to be honest, he did not realize that coming to Canada, he's an engineer, he's got degrees and whatnot, how difficult it's going to be for him to find a job. He thought that he's going to, take a year or two to learn the language and he'll establish himself. That did not happen. So he was not pleased after coming to Canada. He was fooled into thinking that, it's going to be easy for him to establish himself. He was 40 years old when he came. For my mother, the main thing was her children. She knew that for her, it's going to be very difficult. And she used to work 3 jobs. She's an engineer too. She ended working as a personal support worker, right? This is the reality for most immigrants. But she knew that her kids are going to be, first, my mom didn't want us to go into the army. That's before the Russian conflict. She knew that the Ukrainian army is not a good place to be for her kids. There's 3 of us, 3 boys. And she is happy that we're in Canada. Not that she did exceptionally well, or that life was easy for her. She left all her friends, her family, but the kids are much better established, and now the kids are taking care of her. And unfortunately, my stepfather and my mother, they don't live together. But yeah, the motivating factor was motivated by my parents. But for me, obviously, like Canada, and that's for most people in third world countries, it's like it's a place of opportunity, somewhere where you can make it financially, where you watch the movies and you're like, "Whoa, this is how they live." I want that.
So share with us then a little bit about some of the characteristics of the Slavic community. I'm going to anticipate that the average Canadian, the average person listening to this podcast, has familiarity with Ukraine because of the Russian conflict over the last few years. But tell us a little bit about the Slavic community for those that don't know much about the Slavic community, and then the history of Christian faith within the Slavic community, if there is very much at all.
Yeah. So I had to find that Christian Slavic community after my conversion. So Slavic community I didn't know Slavic evangelical community even existed growing up. It was in major cities, the percentage of evangelicals is so small, you don't even know the words like Baptist. So when I was in Ukraine, when I was 13, he said, have you heard of Baptists or Pentecostals? I would ask you, what are you talking about? The Baptists and Pentecostals would be more prominent in the Western Ukraine, but everywhere else in the former Soviet Union. Soviets really worked hard to make a bad name for Baptists and Pentecostals. They labeled them as sectarians, people who are influenced by U.S., who are used by U.S. for U.S. purposes. I've learned about them here. So your typical Ukrainian in Toronto, they have very little understanding about who evangelicals are. Typically, if you think Ukrainian, if you think Russian, you're thinking Orthodox Christian. Evangelical movement, like I said, locally in Western Ukraine, it's quite sizable, but everywhere else, people have this mentality that this is an American movement, this is a Canadian movement, this is not a Ukrainian movement. It's not something that we follow. And most people that would come right now to Canada, which, you would have a slightly larger percentage of people who are already Christian, but your average typical Ukrainian coming into Canada, and we're starting to see these people at church, they have a fairly negative view of evangelicals because back from the Soviet times, and they would feel like this is not a church for us. And you have that mentality that these guys are not really respecting God too much because their buildings are too simple. They're sitting down during service instead of standing up. And this is just not historically our faith. So a lot of, I say, 95 to 98% of Ukrainians coming into Canada right now are thinking that they are, either Greek Catholic, there's such thing, or they're Orthodox, and Protestantism is not for them. And Protestants could be sectarians, and we just don't know who they are, and it's best to avoid them.
Right. So what you're saying is that there's a common Orthodox understanding, but the concept of an evangelical Protestant faith is somewhat foreign. So would you say then that is there an openness, or is there a greater degree of a hardness to the gospel in the community?
To the gospel, it's hard to share the gospel. It's hard to talk about Jesus to someone you don't know. Because if somebody you know closely, somebody that you have a relationship with, you can kind of, people have this understanding that people in Protestant churches or Baptist are a little weird. Because why would you go to a church in Ukraine that nobody else goes to? You're probably a weird, non-standard person just doing your weird thing. It's just, it's like, just like anywhere else, trying to push through a new approach is difficult. So there is and then there is the understanding from the Orthodox Church is actually saying we are not allowing you to go to those churches. You should not, if you go to an Orthodox church, even once or twice a year, or something that we faced, if you ask somebody who you don't know well enough, and they are already even going to Orthodox church once a year, if they call up their priest and say, "What do you think about me going to your church?" they will say no. We had, I'll give you an example. Our family member had a baby born, and they wanted to get the baby baptized in Orthodox church. And they're not very religious at all, and they know us very well. I said right away, I don't want to be the godfather because I don't believe in baby baptism. But my wife said, I'll do it for tradition. I said, okay, you can do whatever you want. But the priest would allow anybody. You can be an atheist. You can be anybody you want. But the moment the priest found out that the wife goes to a Baptist church, he says, no, you cannot be the godmother of this child. We are the Orthodox are realizing that that there's friction, that they don't want to lose people, and they're telling their congregations, however they can, this is not our faith. This is not, you're not to go to these churches. So there is that reluctance. I'm not saying necessarily to the gospel, because to get reluctance to the gospel, you need to share the gospel. Once you share the gospel, Ukrainians will react the same. I would say maybe better than your average Canadian. Once you get a chance to share the gospel, they're just like everyone else. They're motivated to make a life for themselves. They're here to live a good life, to make a name for themselves, to buy the house, buy the car, go on vacation, have their kids go through university. They have the same mentality as everyone else, right? So once you're able to share the gospel, many of them will tell you that I'm not changing my life or my pursuits or my desire to be in certain types of sin for the gospel. But even sharing the gospel is going to be difficult because they have that first barrier saying, your church is not the church to share that information.
Friends, we'll get back to my interview with Alexander Krupin in just a moment. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know about Tropinka Summer Camp. Tropinka is the largest Russian-speaking overnight camp in Canada, and their aim is to excel in all aspects of providing overnight camp experience to Canadian children. They carefully select and train their staff members to accommodate every child and continue to enjoy their camp in a safe and fun environment. In the years to come, they're hoping to open throughout Canada and the United States. If you would like to volunteer or to give to Tropinka Camp Ministry, you can visit Tropinka, TROPINKA.ca to learn more. And now back to my interview with Alexander Krupin. I want to get to in a moment the fact that you both run a decking company and you're also pastoring, but share with us a little bit about the story and the journey from coming to Christ, watching 100 Huntley Street, taking down your notes, coming to know Jesus better, and then the decision at some point to pastor a church, to reach the Slavic community with the gospel.
So I started attending a people's church, but again, it's a huge church. I didn't get any community sense or didn't have any friends. My television was my source. And then they advertised Circle Square Ranches on television. If you can be and I fill out an application, mail the application, and that summer I go to a Circle Square Ranch camp, and I'm able to meet some other Christians for the first time. I get baptized at the People's Church. I started to meet other Christians through ICQ. I don't know if you remember ICQ. It was a chat app. And somebody recommended, I had some questions. So I just had friends in the States who were Christian, and we just exchanged different messages. And I had to start getting questions from rabbis. Now, the way rabbis now view me as a Christian is, because I still keep that connection with the rabbis here in Toronto. The way they see me is, here is someone who is one of us, who is a Jew, who's breaking the first commandment. He is having other gods before the God of Israel. He is making Jesus equal with God. He is going down a very wrong path, and we need to save him. So they're working on me and really trying to convince me that Jesus could not be the Messiah. I reach out to Jews for Jesus. I develop a relationship with them. I go on a mission trip with them to New York City and start getting some friends there. And I decide to be a missionary with Jews for Jesus and study at Moody Bible Institute. I'm accepted for that program, etc. But the questions from the rabbis become more and more loud and become more and more unanswered. Unfortunately, I couldn't get good answers here to the questions that they were raising. The Jews are very well knowledgeable in the scriptures. On the other hand, I always liked, to be honest, I wanted to have a Slavic wife, but I thought that Slavic evangelicals do not exist. By then, I've never met them. I didn't know that they exist. I didn't know that there are huge Slavic evangelical communities in the States. So I'm trying to, have a relationship with girls. I'm getting older. I'm 17, right? And I'm not meeting any Slavic girls, and I wanted to have a Slavic girl. So I have that. I'm not able to form good relationships close relationships at the church. Very few friends who are really set to follow Jesus, and most people that I met in church are, we're not as interested in their faith. I had some older friends who were 40 years old, but I do have a lot of friends in school. So peer pressure from school, desire to find a girlfriend, a wife, and not finding her, and strong questions from the rabbi. That was probably the biggest thing. Makes me question my faith and decide that maybe I'm just going to follow God, but not necessarily Jesus. I'll just be a good person and follow the principles of the Bible. So at that point, I decided not to go to Moody, actually establish my own business, follow my heart, which I like construction, and I wanted to make money. I wanted to have money when I'm rich, and I love deck building. So I established a business, but living without Jesus. Fast forward to 25, I go to U of T, I get a degree in civil engineering, complete my education in engineering, I establish a business, but life without Jesus is life without God. And that's one thing I came to realize through many painful situations. At 25, I realized no Jesus, no God. With Jesus, there is God. There is no relationship with God outside of Jesus. It took me 8 years to realize it, but I finally realized it, and I joined a Russian. I go to People's Church for a couple of months, and again, not being able to be close with the community, not being able to have friends. Even though I quickly convert my close friend to Christianity. Well, the Lord converts him, but through us spending a lot of time together. How people who just come to the faith, they have a lot more connections and a lot more fervor when they share with others. So I have one Christian friend, But we find a church, a Slavic church, and there's a lot of young people. That's where I met my wife. I had to have a youth group. I quickly join. I get on fire. I'm like, let's go on camping trips. Let's do this. Let's do evangelism projects. Because I know what it's like being without Jesus. I know what it's like being with Jesus. I've tried. I walked away. I came back. I'm certain. So I get very involved in the church. So I quickly progressed to, being on the committee, like elders. I progressed to establishing ministries because that's all I'm concerned about. The biggest thing, the biggest value in life is your salvation. There's nothing more important than salvation. And I know what it's like to live without Jesus. And I'm really excited to get as many people into the kingdom as possible and get the youth group excited. And we start doing different projects. Unfortunately, the church that I was in it's a very legalistic church, and there was a lot of pushback against that. They're like, let's not focus on bringing new people in. Let's just keep what we have, and we have to keep the traditions of the fathers. We got our saying from the hymnal books. We got to dress a certain way on all of it. It's just like the Pharisees that I had in school growing up. So there's a lot of tension within that church. Not that I became a church pastor, but the pastor was on my side. And he couldn't fight against not even the majority of the church, people who owned the building. There's people who put the ownership of the building under a few individuals who said, we're the originals, it's going to be our way, or you guys can leave. So I encourage our pastor. We invested everything we have. We sold our apartment, took money out of business, and we bought our own church building. Under myself and my wife, not under the charity, and gave the church back then free rent. And our pastor, came and he became a pastor of that church. And after about 5-6 years, he kind of retired, stepped away, and he said, "I think you should lead." And after some prayer and discernment, I became the pastor of that church.
Wow! And so that church is now Light to the World Church, which is in Toronto. Yeah. Now you touched on it a little bit there, but you got a civil engineering degree, and you were very much into construction. So share with us what your life looks like now. You're pastoring Light to the World Church, but then you also have this other thing going. So tell us a little bit about this other thing that you also do.
Everything that I do, I try to glorify the Lord in everything that I do, and I have a number of businesses. One business is 3 different brand names. It's building decks in Toronto and Kawartha areas. In the Toronto area, or Muskoka's Kawartha area is a different brand, and Ottawa is the 3rd brand. So it's kind of like a small franchise system. The bigger part of the business is the material sales side, where we sell construction materials. We're just working on releasing our own brand that we're manufacturing of decking. And we're a major supplier of composite decking materials, thermally treated woods, PVC decking. How does this ministry is always number one? So when we have a camp this summer, I was at camp for 7 weeks in Ontario and 1 week in Quebec. And in that time, I would go to Toronto not more than for on average half a day a week. So it really, ministry takes priority. But I'm not doing something in the ministry where somebody else could be doing it or doing a better job. So like right now in the fall time, I'm pastoring a church, but let's say I'm not a good pastor. If somebody wants to call me and just really, how people they don't want an answer, they just want somebody to listen for 3 hours to their ideas. I'm very bad at that. I just think, and you know what? And it's not that I'm not doing the ministry that I'm supposed to be doing. I just think I'm going to be more productive, making the money in the business, growing the business, and then using that money for God's glory. Because establishing a lot of new ministries requires finances. Anytime, when we started the ministry in Kenya, and you're like, God put on my heart to open an orphanage for street children and do this. Good luck getting any funding from anybody. It's got to be all your money. Once it's up and running, other people join in. And there are other projects and other things where money from the business is part of the ministry. So I'm not the guy. I'm not a guy who will sit on the phone for 3 hours and listen to somebody just talk without actually trying to solve a problem that they have, right? Which is okay. You need those people too in the church. I'm not that person, but when it comes to doing something at the church, instead of the mentality that we have, even though we're a small church, instead of one person or 2 people doing everything, for a small church like ours, let's say we minister on a regular basis about 80 people a week, okay, that we're seeing youth and adults. But we have 5 people preaching, and we all take turns. We have so many people doing worship. We have people doing cleanup. We have different people clean cooking. We have volunteers doing administration. We have administration, somebody doing bookkeeping. So the model that we have is that everybody does something in the real world, and they do some ministry also, which is different from the model where I mostly do my real world job. I donate, and a few people in the church do something. I think I like our model. I think it's more biblical. And if I am called to do something for the ministry, if I'm called to speak at a conference or do something else, that will take priority over any business. But in the absence of having other significant ministry opportunities, I will be doing work because work is part of my ministry, making money and interacting with people. And also, it's important, I think, for pastors, for anyone in the ministry, to meet with real life people, to know what it's like to, put in 8 hours of back-breaking work, doing same thing over and over, building decks or doing other things day by day. I interact with these people. I talk with them. I see our sales team all the time. I see our managers. So I think it's just how God designed me to be in the world, but not of the world, to be focused on the ministry and at work. And at the moment, I don't have a full-time calling. There is nothing that I feel requires my full-time attention. I mean, only camp takes full-time. And that might change if God provides for me an opportunity to be involved in a ministry where I feel like full-time of my gifts and abilities are going to be used. It is going to take, 60 hours a week of my time. And it's going to be time used productively. Then I know we already have managers in place in the business. Well, I'll tell them, you run it because I need to be here. But at the moment, I'm not running after any ministry commitment because if I feel that I'm for better use at work, I will actually go to work and focus on being here. But that might change in the future.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying because I think it boils down to a principle that where can I build God's kingdom? And you're seeing that there is a beautiful balance between there are gifts that I have that can bless our church in conjunction with the other gifts that are around the table to serve the church. But there are these other gifts that I have been able to use and been educated with that I can pursue. Also, the decking company, the decking business, the oversight of that. You touched on something I think that's really important as well, that as I define covocational, I see it as an equal calling between, your business, how you're working in the marketplace, and then equally to the church. Bivocational for a lot of people, I think, is more so defined by something I have to do in the marketplace, but what I really want to do is to be full-time in the church. And so what I hear you talking about is, as you approach this more from a covocational perspective, is again, there's kingdom building that's happening through the context of the marketplace and the benefit from it and the way that we can build ministries. But it's also allowing you to approach the church ministry differently in that you're saying, I need to have other people in the church raised up using their gifts. There are 5 of us that share the preaching load. And so the goal isn't to have you preaching every week. The goal is to allow me to continue to serve in the marketplace and then be able to use my gifts, but raise up others in the context of the local church. Do you concur? What are your thoughts just based on what I was sharing there?
I agree with you 100%. And I think it's, like I said, it's a good model. I think everybody in the church should be doing something. It should not be left to certain individuals. I think cases where somebody is on full-time support from the church, they're more exceptionally, even Paul, a lot of the times, he'd be making tents 5 days of the week, 6 days of the week. And it's not, I don't think he was just doing that because, he felt strong. There was no other option for him. I said, I had full freedom to take money from you, but it didn't. It would actually be better. I think for them, well, if he was there, you could say that Paul could have done a lot more Bible studies if he didn't have to work. But he said, no, I think I'll do better as a Bible teacher if you observe me work, if you observe me pay my own bills, and then come to you on volunteer basis and pour my heart and life into you, maybe at night, maybe on Shabbat, you do all of that. That will give better effect than you guys giving me a little bit of money. I don't need much, and I'm not doing any work. I encourage our young people to get a profession, get a job, to be productive in the workplace, to learn to make their own income, to learn to make money. Then, like for some positions, we'll offer full-time when it's absolutely necessary for somebody to do it. And like I said, for myself, Maybe a time will come in my life where God will say, do 100% work. Maybe, hopefully not. But there could be a time where God will come, I have something for you that's so special and it needs all of your attention. That
Mm.
opportunity that hasn't come. So I don't feel like, oh, work is holding me back from fulfilling my calling. Nobody's calling me to anything full time at the moment that I think lines up with my gifts and where I'm better used. Because if, for instance, you tell me, go do hospital visits, hypothetically speaking, 5 days a week, 40 hours a week, right? I don't think I'll do better at that than I am doing at work. I think I'm fulfilling God's calling better at work at the moment, but that might change. So
Mm.
like I said, that breakdown work ministry will change depending on where God's leading me.
Yeah. You've referenced it multiple times in our conversation so far, but please unpack for us what is Krupin Summer Camp Ministry and how it also works in conjunction with your church and in reaching the Slavic community in Toronto and beyond.
Krupin Camp is a camp that I founded soon after recommitting my life to the Lord. I was 26 years old. The idea is very simple: create a quality summer camp, overnight camp experience for the children in the Slavic community, those who understand Russian or Ukrainian, attract primarily non-Christian people with a quality camp experience at a good price, and tell them about Jesus. Have
Hmm.
quality counselors, good team, and over the years, it takes years to build your reputation. By now, we are the largest overnight Russian-speaking camp in Canada. We have a good reputation among non-Christians who know our camp to be a good camp, and they don't mind the Christian aspect. So, Matt, you were at our camp for a few days. 80-90% of the kids, depending on the week, are from non-Christian families. They come, they love the games, but they hear the preaching. Right? There's the Bible lesson in the morning. There is the preaching in the evening. There's the Christian songs. They memorize verses, but most importantly, they're exposed to other Christians, to the leaders. The counselors are all baptized believers, right? And we have an opportunity through the ministry of this camp to share the gospel. Now, for those young people that we have in our church and older people who also volunteer at camp, we have an opportunity to serve. We tell them, give us a week, 2 weeks, 3, 4, 5 weeks, depending on the situation of your time. Sacrifice, don't go on your vacation, come to camp and invest yourself in sharing the gospel. So camp is a platform where you can actually take someone and have them listen attentively to the gospel. After they've heard the gospel, which some go for 1 week, some for 2, some for 3, hundreds of different children come to our camp every summer in Ontario and Quebec. Some of them, a small percentage, actually, interestingly, I was driving my kids to school today, and I was telling the kids, I try to maximize my time with the kids, the importance of evangelism, how saving a soul is the most important thing in life. And I'm thinking about a certain guy who kind of lives in our area, and he's standing right there at the bus stop. I said, hey, jump in. We're going to drive you on I didn't drive him all the way to the subway, but almost to the subway. And this guy now comes to our youth group. So when we evangelize, we get these young people who are not Christian, who are like, some are committing right away. Some are like, I like the camp. I like the atmosphere. I'm not quite sure if I'm quite there yet, but I'd like to know more. Okay. So right now we have our regular meetings. We're renting a school gym in North York. We have about 40 young people coming, teenagers, and we have a group of 10 young adults that are leading them. So post camp, at camp you had over 100 people say, I'm committing to follow the Lord. Who wants to have eternal life? Follow the Lord. Over 100 people say that. Some are geographically in different areas. We encourage them to find other churches, and they do, and they get baptized in those churches, I'm finding out later. But most of them, unfortunately, was just a camp experience, but some of them, it's a real decision. And they follow through. They come to the youth group that we run all year round. And once they actually, here's what happens. Once they are serious about their faith, actually, when they get baptized, now we get them on the team that reaches out to other kids. Now they come as counselors, so we complete the cycle. This is the biggest evangelism project for our church. There's not a lot of projects. When I evaluate a project that I think is actually working, I want to see baptisms happen. I don't want to do projects where people make a profession of faith and then I don't see them, even though we live in the same geographical area. I know that God touches people and uses many different ways to touch people. But if you want to measure if long-term, ministry, if you're evangelizing effectiveness, you need to see some baptisms. Maybe you don't see all the effects, but you got to see some. After 3-5 years, I mean, there's got to be some baptisms. So this is the biggest, working evangelism project for our church. The second biggest one is obviously personal relationships, Bible studies, kind of like for beginners, like Alpha courses. They work for adults well. We're only starting to work with the children's parents, but I'm seeing it. We had to stop during COVID. That was difficult. The camp was growing slowly, so we didn't get to these numbers right away. But what I'm seeing now is that continual, investment into new kids hearing about the gospel, kids slowly coming, accepting the gospel, starting to tell others through the camp and throughout the year. So he keeps the youth very motivated that what I'm doing is bringing people in God's kingdom. It's getting the kids who are already committed to the Lord off their phones, Instagram, to a degree. Nothing is perfect, of course, but it's helping them, giving them that life purpose, right? I'm not just here to show, or maybe I'm not just here to chase a good career and make lots of money. I'm here for God's kingdom. So that's how Trapinka is working.
Well, and as you mentioned, I was there with you for a few days this summer, and this is a primary ministry of your church throughout the summer, but it's also a ministry that the evangelical Slavic community across Canada, it seems to be supporting as well. There were counselors and cabin leaders there from Alberta and other parts of Canada who'd flown in to be part and to see this camp happen. I think a lot of those that will be listening to this are probably wondering what the current state of the war is in Ukraine. I'm assuming you know people that are there. And could you share with us a little bit about the current state of the war? And then also a second question there is language. When I was at the camp, it was Russian. Some would be Russian background, I'm assuming, but others would be Ukrainian. So maybe just briefly, before you talk about the current state of the war, can you speak a little bit to language and Ukrainian versus Russian language? And maybe it's maybe the answer is simple as regional.
I'm myself from the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, but although I can speak Ukrainian, in the church, among believers, generally, there is peace and understanding that we're prioritizing, the fact that we are God's children, we're in God's kingdom, fighting the devil over the divisions that exist between Russians and Ukrainians, generally speaking. If you're trying to reach Ukrainian-speaking people, our camp is not the best tool. We're reaching well the Ukrainians who are from the Russian parts. We have some Ukrainians who are coming from the Western parts who are not Christian, but they're not anti-Russian language, because obviously, there are some Ukrainians who cannot bear to hear any Russian words. They wouldn't come to our camp, and we just can't be all things to all people. So we can't, if we don't even have the option to speak all Ukrainian, because our workers are, for the most part, don't speak Ukrainian, and most of our staff, they're people who are born in Canada or came here when they're very young. So among Christians, I would say generally, it's quite peaceful. Within our own church, which is quite small, we have both people from Russia and Ukraine. People are anti-war. They don't want to see people die, but we don't get into politics too much because people have relatives on both sides, and everybody wants the war to end. And in Ukraine right now, generally, like a quick summary, what we have, a lot of people are, hopeful that a deal is going to be made. I think after so many years of war, somebody wants closure. I think people are tired of the war. It's wearing people out. I don't see that enthusiasm that you had at the beginning that somehow Ukraine is going to reclaim all of its land from Russia and go back to the 1991 boundaries. The hope is that somehow it's going to end and somehow people will stop dying, and then a lot of families separated because men are not allowed to leave Ukraine. I think it would be a good idea to give men the freedom to stay in the country and fight for it. Or if they don't want to stay in the country, if they don't want to fight for it, let them go. Because unfortunately in Ukraine, the children of the politicians are not fighting. There's a lot of rich people who are making money at this. Their kids are not fighting. And the poor people are held hostage and sometimes made to go to war, made to fight. And I think, I hope that the resolution is coming to this.
Just briefly and in closing, Alex, could you speak to those that are listening that have identified that they have some Slavic neighbors? What is a way that those listening can best support and connect with, and eventually, Lord willing, sow the gospel to their Slavic neighbors?
Excellent question. A lot of Slavic people, even Christians, are not are learning that they cannot build connections with the local people, the Canadians here. They're realizing that for a short period of time, they'll be super friendly. They'll smile, say, "How are you? We love you. You're so great. Do you need this? Do you need that?" Just for sure. But there's a barrier. And I think it's not just the Ukrainian culture, it's the Southern cultures and others. Invite them for dinner. Share your life. Talk to them. Don't talk to them like, I'm this, you're that. I'm human, you're human, you went through something, I'm going through something. And genuinely become their friend, like Jesus and Zacchaeus. If you're able to become friends with that Slavic family, and not just for, like I said, don't make them feel like you're just inviting them for dinner so you can share the gospel right away. Become their friend. See where they're going, what they like to do. They would like to have some Canadian friends and get to know them. I think the Canadian society in general is more individualistic, and everybody's so busy. The schedules, so you have all the children practices, you have all these things. You have so many things in our schedules. We just can't meet, sit down for a meal together, get to know each other, do things together. They can help you do something. Become their friend. I find that Slavic people, sometimes they're in Canada for 20, 30 years. You look at the birthday party, you don't see anybody who is Canadian comes to their birthday parties. Neither are they invited to somebody else's birthday party. So it's generally what the Ukrainian, Slavic people feel is there's always going to be that distance. You're always going to be the immigrant. You're always going to be the outsider, even though there's going to be a lot of friendliness on the surface level. There's a deeper connection is not going to be formed. I know that sometimes Canadians in general have a difficulty forming these connections with each other. That's an issue that needs to be addressed. But if you want to share Christ with someone, it's through a close relationship that's going to take years. And don't be in a rush to start, sharing your beliefs. Wait for them to ask. Because if they sense this hypocrisy, that you're really friendly to them just to share the beliefs, that's going to close that door. But if you're serious about it, you have a neighbor who is Slavic, be prepared to invest in a long-term relationship.
Alex, thank you for investing in this podcast and joining us today. It's so appreciated. I'm sure this will bless a lot of those that are listening.
Thank you for having me, man. It was my pleasure. God bless.
Well, friends, I'm sure you would agree that there is much from my conversation with Alexander Krupin that could be applied as this episode's action step. The thing that I want to emphasize, however, as it relates to this conversation, is when Pastor Alex was talking for the need for pastors to connect with everyday people, those that are working full-time jobs, and there are not people that they're going to simply find or meet in the context of the church. For Pastor Alex, this has continued to lead him towards covocational ministry, both working in the marketplace and running his decking business and also serving the church. And I think his challenge is a very helpful one towards pastors that are surrounded constantly by Christian people or those in their church and are therefore having very little to no opportunity to meet those who are not part of their church. And here is the action step. If you are a pastor who is working full-time in the context of a church, to begin asking yourself the question, reflecting upon, and then making some changes. Where are the people, the everyday people that are not part of your church, and how can you begin spending more time with them? Maybe it's a recreational athletics league. Maybe it is through some sort of other hobby connection. Maybe it's through your kids and their school. Once again, how can you spend more time with people that are not connected to your church, who are everyday people in your city, who are the ones that have the need to hear the gospel and to meet a Christian and for you to become friends with them? This is a very important point and one I hope we take seriously out of this conversation with Pastor Alex. Well, once again, thanks for listening to this episode of the Sowers Podcast. A new episode is going to be released next week. And so here is a clip from that conversation that will be released with James Clarence, who's serving in Yellowknife Northwest Territories.
But I'm like, it's Canada's time. And why are we, losing some of our best people to somewhere else? Like, why are we not raising up people from within? Why do we have to go get trained elsewhere? And I know I went and got trained elsewhere, so I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but here in my heart, I'm like, we need to see that in Canada. We need to see ministry schools, Bible colleges, seminaries, churches, raising up people from within for Canada so that, again, we can actually step into what God has for us. And we got to stop the tall poppy syndrome. We got to stop the being the little brother of America living in its shadow. We got to start stepping into the destiny that God has by going after heart and soul what he's spoken over our nation. So I think that is my prayer since I was, 16 and the Lord spoke to me about ministry.